that indeed. You will see China's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ying Fu. Now, this individual was there at the Bilderberg conference. Also, Yiping Huang, professor of economics, China Center for Economic Research at the Peking University, was also invited to Bilderberg 2012. Now, this gentleman, that was talking about the people who have been financed by the Rockefeller Corporation, by the Ford Corporation for many, many years. Now, collusion between the U.S. government and the Chinese government is in progress. Now, you would think, Alex, this should be the front page news in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Financial Times, in Time Magazine. Now, you will not see any of this because, needless to say, what we're seeing is an active participated in a debate on the destruction of the American dollar at the expense of the Chinese currency, yuan, are also involved in the Bilderberg meeting this year, who also participated in the collusion. Chang Li, the director of research and senior fellow at John Thornton China Center with Brookings Institute, and of course Robert Rubin, the former Secretary of the Treasury and also co-chairman of the powerful Council of Foreign Relations. These are the individuals who are plotting with the Chinese government and the American government to destroy the United States dollar, and I think it should be on the front page of every newspaper in America.
And paying $22 billion of U.S. tax money to move General Motors, Volt, and Cadillac factories to China. So we don't just pay, and then our traitorous globalist government has tax incentives to move our jobs to China, but now our government pays to shut us down. Let me ask you this detailed question, because from my sources, going back to 75 and those agreements with Nixon, there is a strategic plan with the United States and China, and that there was a deal offered by Russia around that time to do a sneak attack with the U.S. on China, that China said, basically, well, that Russia said no, and so the deal was made for the, quote, U.S., the bankers, to go with China, but then you have the double game of the bases being set up around China. So I guess the globalists make deals with them, the carrot, but then have the stick. Does that mesh with your deep sources and research? What's the real lay of the land with the three power blocks, or four, but Europe and the United States and England and the Commonwealth is one or two, depending on how you look at it, Russia, and then, of course, what's happening with China, with Japan basically allied out there with the United States. What's the real power breakdown globally?
Actually, it's a very, very good question. You brought up a very interesting point. Now, you have to go back, actually, to the fact that the critical breakdown, which the Bilderbergers and their cohorts have been working on intensely, as you said, going back to the 70s, actually since the 1960s, was the breakup of Bretton Woods system, without which you could have never had the oil hoax of the second part of the 70s. And, of course, that whole thing was destroyed by Nixon beginning in 1971, in 1973-74, extending all the way through the Carter administration and the second oil hoax, 79-80. Now, what they've done, talking about these divisions between different countries and the Chinese and the Russians, now the European oligarchy was intent on breaking up the system that FDR had set up for post-World War II order that was premised on the decolonization of the planet. So what they've done, the elite, they took a series of steps in the mid to late 1960s in Britain, for example, under Harold Wilson, to weaken and effectively destroy the Bretton Woods system in 1971. That's one of the reasons why we had Nixon going to China, Kissinger going to China, the Chinese and the Americans working together, also with the Russians on the other side. Now, what happened was, another individual involved was, of course, George Shultz. So you see, the stage was set to go from a system of fixed exchange rate that gave an advantage to real productive development and investment. And after 1971, everything went in favor of the speculators. And that, again, something that was very much decided between the Americans and the Chinese, because you could never get something like this done without these other big nations, superpowers, being on the take or knowing what was going on. So you see, the oil shock of 1973, the 400% targeted increase which Bilderberg talked about, and we have the documents to prove it in May 1973, saying that in 6 months prices are going to go to, between $10.50 and $12 per barrel. It went to $11.65. Now, if you look back and compare those numbers today, it probably goes way beyond the 400%. But what I'm saying is all of that was aimed at launching a systemic or systematic process of the looting of the actual productive wealth of all of the major nations of the planet. And what you have, for example, in countries such as Saudi Arabia and all those other countries of the Persian Gulf, are pseudo-states that are under the domination of the city of London, which is just, another way to say Bilderberg, or however you want to call it, the financial elite, the financial oligarchy. And needless to say, the Chinese were in on it back in the 1970s, and they're in on it today.
How does Russia play into this?
Well, Putin is in an interesting position. On the one hand, the Russians and the Chinese, they obviously understand that, they have to work together. That if they don't work together, you have, the United States government, you have Bilderberg, you have, London, you have all these nations actually going up against the interests of the Russians. But also, on the other hand, the Russians are fully aware that the Chinese and the Americans are working together, destroying the United States dollar. So what the Russians are actually doing, working on right now, is bilateral agreements with the Chinese. And of course, Russia's strength, and they're playing to its strength, is its energy reserve. And Bilderberg, that's one of the things they talked about at the meeting, is particularly concerned about this thing called South Stream pipeline, which is a mega project of over $20 billion. Now, South Stream gas pipeline is to transport Russian natural gas under the Black Sea to the southern part of the European Union through Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, and Slovakia, and then on to Italy and Austria, supplying over 60 billion cubic meters of gas annually. And of course, Bilderberg is extremely concerned is that South Stream could turn into a major victory for Russia at the expense of the European Union, American-backed Nabucco pipeline from Turkey to Austria. And of course, of even greater concern to Bilderberg is Putin's attempt, and this is where Russia and China come in working together, is Putin's attempt to integrate Asia into a cohesive bloc under the leadership of Russia. And of course, this merger, this union between the Russians and the Chinese will preempt all Bilderberg-led meddling, because what they're planning to is they're planning to turn Pakistan and Iran into full members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The repercussions of this will be groundbreaking, according to one European Bilderberger security expert.
Well, if you look at what the West has been doing in Pakistan, is driving Pakistan, who's hated the Russians and the Chinese to a certain extent, into the arms of the Chinese. So again, you see a double game where Kissinger and these people actually have more investments in China. So in the final equation, they just want to have it all balanced out, and in the final equation, sell the United States down the river. As you said, we're just more real estate to them. How are things going for them? Because the break interrupted you. We never went back to Italy. I mean, how are things going for the banksters? How are things going for the money changers? Are things going well, or are they going badly?
Well, things are not going as well as they had hoped. Obviously, Europe is in a systemic, breakdown. United States is in a terrible situation. You have all these nations such as Russia, which, allegedly or almost were subjugated back in the 1990s with that alcoholic usurper by the name of Yeltsin, and now Putin steps in and he turns the whole thing around, and he basically runs roughshod over the United States policy, and he's a much better negotiator than all these other Bilderbergers are. And so needless to say, they're very upset. They also understand, according to what was said in the Bilderberger meeting, is that, they basically given up. Kasparov, who's a former world chess champion, was in attendance, as you know, at this meeting. But according to Bilderberger sources, Bilderberg has very little confidence in Garry Kasparov. And as one Bilderberger source said, his street smarts relating to Kasparov leave a lot to be desired. And as one American Bilderberger stated, and I quote, if this was a boxing match, we'd be looking at a mismatch of the century. That's Putin versus Kasparov. We'll have to wait. And while Bilderberg continues to finance Kasparov's United Civil Front in hopes of stirring up trouble in Russia, the secretive cabal is out looking for wiser and smarter and more charismatic figures to give Putin a run for his money, and they're going to have a hell of a hard time doing this, because Putin is a very, 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 very difficult nut to break. Now, going to Italy, I don't know how much time we have, but just a few words about that. Italy is not Spain. Spain is being wiped out, is actually, giving up for dead. That's what Bilderberg has agreed on. Now, Italy is in a much better situation because, unlike Spain, Italy has never had much of a real estate bubble. Second of all, Italy, unlike Spain, has very little private debt. And also, Italy is home to the Venetian black nobility and its far-reaching first-rate banking apparatus, stretching back almost 750 years, as well as hundreds of first-rate companies with secure niches in the world export markets. And most of these companies, they form an important part of some of the world's most powerful secret societies and private organizations, such as Bilderberg Group. Then, of course, there's another very important link in Italy. There's an interlocked relationship between the mafia, the state, the corporate world, and the clergy, which isolates Italy from any impending crisis. And finally, again, Italy is home to this very little-known institution called the Vatican. So, all in all, Italy is in a much greater position. They're home to Venetian black nobility, which is the base of what Bilderberg is today. Also, we've talked about that in the end game, the Venetian nobility. But, the situation is not as well as it could be for us, but obviously much better than they had hoped, several years back.
What about domestic things here in the U.S., tidbits? I see the media swinging towards Mitt Romney. I see the left establishment coming out against Obama. I see a lot of kingmakers drifting towards him. I see Bloomberg coming out and doing a purposed leak saying he's endorsing Romney. Did you get any word on who the Bilderberg Group wants for the U.S. elections? Because our information looks like they're leaning towards Romney.
I'd say the same thing. I don't have a lot of information on that, but from bits and pieces that I've heard, that makes a lot of sense because Obama, he's spent, he's used goods. There's just too many people that figured his game, and if they figured out Obama's game, he's no good to the Bilderbergers. So they need somebody else, a fresh face with fresh ideas. So I see quite likely because you also see a lot of positioning behind the scenes. There's a lot of in the intelligence world, there's a lot of consistently games are being played and system being tested. So the way system is being tested right now in the intelligence world, I see a lot of possibilities that Romney is actually going to be the presidential candidate, and that's all going to be obviously depend on his ability to present his ideas to the American public. And this is exactly the same thing that happened back in 2008, and we talked about this on your show. Bilderberg has said Obama is going to be the candidate, and it's his presidency to lose. He won the presidency. He didn't do as well as they had hoped. Now, 4 years later, a new man is going to come in. Again, that all depends on Romney. It doesn't depend on Bilderberg. They can pick a candidate. They got two horses in this race, the Democrats and the Republicans. But it's up to Romney to actually make a play and convince, quote unquote, the Americans that he is going to be the leader to lead America, through the difficult period.
So at a certain point, as long as they own both the candidates, they'll let them battle it out.
Exactly. They always own the candidate. The game plan has been set. The pieces are in place. It's just a question of there's always 10-15% unknown factors of what could actually happen. We talked about this scenario back in 2006, 2007 when there was plans or at least talk about assassinating Ron Paul, and the trial balloon at the time was what would happen if this were to happen. That thankfully didn't happen. But the point is that these are the kinds of games that they play.
Hold on, I want to hear in our final segment what you're getting at with that. Amazing information with Daniel Estulin, DanielEstulin.com. Hi, this is Alex Jones. Did you know that the global... All right, he's with us about 5 minutes into the next hour, then a big news blitz ahead of a guest joining us who's having his home taken, a World War II hero. Daniel, you were finishing up with Ron Paul. Then I want to ask you about the U.S. economy briefly, and then a few years ago you got invited